this morning has given us a lot to think about, and now we're going to turn from the genealogy of language to the materiality of language. And we're going to hear from Martin Kern, who is the inaugural Greg and Joanna Zellick Professor in Asian Studies at Princeton. Born and educated in Germany, he received his doctorate in Sinology, German Literature, and Art History from Cologne University in 1996. He taught at the University of Washington and Columbia before moving to Princeton. In 2000, he was elected a member of the APS in 2015. Excuse me. Martin Kern's research cuts broadly across the fields of literature, philology, history, religion, and art in ancient and medieval China, with a dual focus on poetry and the formation of ancient Chinese textuality and cultural memory. The author and editor of 9 books and some 80 book chapters and articles, he studied the composition, reception, and canonization of early Chinese texts, including through the analysis of recently excavated manuscripts and from comparative perspectives. He publishes on a wide range of topics, including the history of Chinese literature, the performance of texts in political and religious ritual, authorship as a historical and theoretical problem, issues of writing and orality, the early development of Chinese literary thought, style and rhetoric in philosophy and historiography, the rise of Chinese political philosophy, calligraphy, and the history and current issues of sinology as a global field. Martin Kern, please come up.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Well, that was a mouthful of introduction. Thank you. I will focus on something very much more limited today. Is this up? Yeah, it's up. The materials I will show you today all come from recent discoveries which over the past 3 decades have led to the formation of a new global academic field. That field is called Early China. Don't ask me why it's not called Ancient China. It seems ancient is reserved for Greece, and so we say Early China. A field that is now extremely dynamic both in China and in Japan, Europe, and North America. Today, let me introduce you to this new field, and I have to apologize. I'm not going to be able to deliver a lot of data-driven results because we are not there yet. We are just beginning over the last 10, 15 years to figure out what is all this stuff that we see. And I wanted to introduce some of these artifacts to you, and then I wish to focus on the material dimensions of early Chinese texts, which leads then to questions about the sociology of text, the sociology of reading, and ultimately what all of this leads up to, and is currently leading up to, is a complete rethinking of early Chinese intellectual history, where so far we have far more questions than we have answers. So let's look at some of the things. By the way, that clock is not working here. It's still at 20 minutes, so that's fine. If you keep it at 20 minutes, I can go for 3 hours. All right, fancy stuff, like this silk funerary banner from 168 BCE, decorated with an entire mythological narrative about the cosmos and the afterworld. Or some very cool things from this large tomb in central southern China, closed in 433 BCE, including this, which has this rack of 64 tuned bronze bells, with each of the oval-shaped bells emitting 2 defined notes depending on where you strike them, and with inlaid inscriptions in gold. After the 5th century BC, it seems the Chinese forgot how to do this, and nobody ever has been able to do something like this since. Or let's look at more than 10,000 inscribed bronze vessels from the 1st millennium BCE that we have right now. All of this is largely the result of the last 20, 30 years. But let's not do that today. How about, although please keep these artifacts in mind because they are context for texts that come out of the same tombs where you see these glorious things. So how about something else? This. Awful mess, right? What is this? Well, these are ancient Chinese manuscripts, especially slips of bamboo and wood, but also wooden boards, and occasionally expensively sheets of silk. So far, these manuscripts date from the 5th century onward. Sometimes the individual bamboo slips often damaged and dispersed in clumps of mud. Sometimes they're pressed together, as you see here, like a piece of layered cake. In each case, the condition is the result of their survival in some waterlogged tomb in southern central China. After their discovery, they need the most meticulous of cleaning. There you see it. And now, where do they come from? Look at this. These are coffins. You see the human body in the coffin, accompanied by swords and all sorts of other paraphernalia, including an ink brush. In another tomb, you see the corpse left by itself and the bamboo slips packed neatly around it. And yet, in another one, the poor chap barely has space in his own coffin, for all the slips packed in there with him, in this case, legal statues and legal cases. So even in the afterlife, he failed to escape his lifelong fate as a local bamboo pusher in charge of administrative and legal affairs. As far as we know, only 2 ancient cultures found it a good idea to put texts into tombs, the Egyptians and the Chinese, and they probably did it for different reasons that we don't fully understand, but we're glad they did. So, how do these bamboo slips look like? Well, think of a sushi mat. Or better not think of a sushi mat, actually. Here's an example not from the watery south, but from the extremely arid northwest, so the northwestern part of China, where China goes into Central Asia, where manuscripts survive not in tombs, but in the ruins of watchtowers and other buildings, in abandoned wells and in pits. While the slips in the south lost their strings long ago, and here you see the strings, leaving us with the problem of puzzling them back into their original sequence, those in the north often remained together as intact manuscripts, as you see here. As we consider the format of such a manuscript, we must think of its limitations. We're not looking at books, but at most what would be chapters in later books. This is fine for administrative documents like the one you see here. And this is a better image of it. But it creates a real problem for literary, philosophical, or historical texts that in our received tradition could easily include 100 of such bamboo scrolls, each with several thousand characters. Grouped together, they usually don't add up to coherent books. Instead, they are physically independent artifacts. And thus, unsurprisingly, the overwhelming number of received texts from early China are anthologies, that is, more or less coherent, but often also very incoherent, compilations of originally distinct texts. This should have been clear enough from the traditional record, but it is becoming inescapably clear with our new manuscripts, and this has serious consequences for how we reconstruct the entire Chinese intellectual history. We stop thinking about books as complete single-authored artifacts. We look at them now as compilations, and we look at these artifacts and see where these compilations come from. So let's also pay attention to layout and calligraphy. Here you see the columns and the comfortable handwriting of some happy local bean counter. Not pretty, but perfectly functional. For comparison, look at this. This is a Lao Tzu manuscript from about 300 BCE. And you immediately grasp the difference between the quick, practical handwriting of the local official and something rather different. A literary text meant not just to be read, but first of all, to be seen. The first is a text without history, written for a specific situational task. The second is a text that signals in its very layout, I am a beautiful copy of something important that existed before me, complete with markers and generous spacing to identify the ends of sections. The first was found above ground, the second in a tomb. Also in the Northwest, you find not only these administrative texts, you also, even in the Northwest, on the border, and I think this is important for how the empire represents itself to the people beyond the border, you find likewise prestigious texts committed to writing. And then they share the same care, beauty, and generosity of space. Now, what you notice here is that writing is probably of primary importance for for the administrative text, for the legal text, and so on. But I think it's secondary for texts like this, where you know that there was already a perfectly functional technology to transmit these texts and to preserve these texts, and that technology was memorization, recitation, and performance. So writing occurs in very different contexts and for very different purposes here. Note also this beautiful white line here. This is where the cord runs across the bamboo slips. Okay, so here again, administrative writing, just to recall this, and you see it's densely packed. It's a very economic use of space. Here, divination texts on wood that clearly have a completely different purpose. The most pervasive genre is this, a tomb inventory, and you see little numbers here, 1 of this, 2 of this, 4 of this, detailing the goods the deceased was bringing along for his or her afterlife. And just to make sure, there also was a letter to the officials of the netherworld announcing his splendid arrival. Now, wood and bamboo were cheap, silk was not. Probably by definition, it was reserved for things important: cultural texts with a pre-existing history, star maps, divination charts, even geographic maps. Perhaps just representations of sheer wealth and control over resources found in aristocratic tombs here. Perhaps truly useful things for the afterlife, as the dead needed orientation both physically and spiritually. Now, silk is a single, flat, smooth surface, but so could be bamboo. If you just bound the slips tightly enough, as in this column divination text, or, most fascinating, in a multiplication table, where you then would run chords diagonally to find the correct number in one swift move. So bamboo is not a single thing, but it is a single surface. So let's look at this alignment of characters. You see here that the characters on the right are evenly spaced, not just vertically, but also horizontally. Those on the left run orderly, top to bottom, but differently on every slip. And you can see, I illustrate this by this line, you can easily see the horizontal order on the right and the lack of it on the left. So what does that mean? The slips on the right were bound as a flat writing service before writing. The slips on the left were probably written individually before they were bound together. Here's another example, and there you see also where the cord runs, and there's space left for that cord. Another example. A bamboo manuscript was thus a textual surface that was continuous but not of one piece. It was strung together of as many as 150 slips, each perhaps half a centimeter wide and up to 50 or 60 centimeters tall, accommodating a total of several thousand characters. When rolled out, the entire text could be close to a meter wide. But what if the strings got loose? For that, one could number the slips on the backside, and here, these dark things, these are numbers. One could number them on the backside, or one could cut diagonal lines, as you see there, these white lines, across the manuscript, marking each slip in its proper place. Already the ancients were terrified by the loss and chaos resulting from broken or rotten slips. They were concerned about textual integrity. What you see here is not just one sushi mat of a manuscript, but 5 such mats with 5 sets of numbers together constituting a single text. Moreover, from the damages at the top, we can reconstruct how the manuscript was originally rolled or flatly folded, or folded in several layers. Such reconstruction is also possible on the grounds of imprints that the inked characters of one slip, when pressed against the back of another one, left there. And what we find is a remarkable variety of book formats that were surely related to the way these texts were used, unrolled slip by slip or unfolded in larger units and then placed flat out. In short, even damage can tell you a lot because it occurs symmetrically. One of the things these material traces tell us are different practices of reading. Consider the text I've shown you so far. They're totally different calligraphic styles, the ways in which a scroll could be read slip by slip or had to be rolled out in its entirety to be legible at all, and the other differences in how text is visually represented, from tight, quickly drafted administrative records to beautiful, generously spaced characters that were clearly objects for display and aesthetic appreciation. We recognize not just different degrees of literacy, and we can talk a lot about that, but we also recognize entirely different types of literacy. In most cases, the scribe who writes one type of document, say these administrative texts, was probably at a loss when he was asked to write another type, and we can see this in the mistakes they make. Very interesting types of mistakes. We can talk about those in the Q&A. And texts were read differently. Some could be silently consulted, for example, a legal statute. Others clearly played their role in ritual performances. Some are pedestrian and pragmatic. Others are symbols of status, both in this life and the next, and their ostentatious value and beauty obviously mattered a great deal for the tomb occupant, or maybe even more for those of his descendants who put him into his tomb and who basked in the reflected glory. In short, we see a multiplicity of shapes, material, purposes, contexts, occasions. For each of these, we must consider specific practices of textual production, circulation, and reception, different literacies, different reading practices, different communal uses. No few of the texts carry titles, often written on the back of the final slip. When the mat was rolled up, you had the title at the end, on the outside, very convenient for shelving. We see concerns with completeness. A manuscript could contain a final note on the total number of characters or the number of sections. We have concerns with textual accuracy, revealing not just the act of writing, but also the act of proofreading and correcting. Accidentally forgotten characters could be added in. Interestingly, such proofreading even concerned characters of no significance, as in these manuscripts here. Here you see an example of two identical texts that had been proofread against one another, and each got additions of various particles. That actually you could do without these particles and the text would read just fine. If an entire phrase or passage was missing, it could be added on the back of the slip. And finally, punctuation. A guidance to the reader that often was provided not by the original scribe, but by another reader who followed him. But also notice what you do not have, and not in a single instance of a literary, historical, or philosophical manuscript. While many of them have titles, not a single one indicates an author. And in fact, no early Chinese text in these manuscripts refers to the author of any other text or to ownership of text. Nobody in early China claimed a text as his or her own, and nobody disputed a parallel version as false. The result is an enormous fluidity of phrases and ideas and a model of ancient textuality that is not based on fixed individual texts with defined boundaries. Instead, philosophical and literary textuality is built on two principles. First, larger textual repertoires or discourses from which each text, including all our manuscripts, is then generated as a particular instantiation. And thus, you can get many parallel versions of the same story, idea, or poem in different books, in different texts, where they mean something different. Nobody in early China ever complains about that. And second, we have a textual practice that is based not on original authorship, but on the compilation of pre-existing textual materials, with the result that most texts from early China are composite artifacts. And this dissolves very much our traditional intellectual history, where we have schools of thought, where we have, a history of philosophy starting with Confucius, and then comes one after another. All of this is now dissolving, or if you would like the metaphor, the strings of this intellectual history are rapidly coming apart. So let me conclude with a few words on what all this means for us today. When making sense of these texts, which is not easy, and there are numerous technical difficulties involved, both in paleography but also in questions of historical phonology, and we can talk more about the technicalities in the Q&A if you like. When making sense of these texts and trying to read them, we either start from our traditional framework of ancient Chinese social and intellectual history and then try to fit our new finds into that framework. That's one way to do it. Or we start from the manuscripts and their archaeological contexts and fundamentally question that traditional framework. As you can imagine, different scholars take different sides in this. In fact, entire different academic and national communities take different sides, because very different things are at stake for us today, at this particular moment in the history of our field. Unlike many of my colleagues in China, who see quite legitimately themselves as part of an unbroken history of scholarship that began with Confucius in 500 BCE, my own cultural, intellectual, and national identity is not invested in the outcome of my research. It's fine with me that we have enough material to deconstruct the inherited orthodoxy while not having nearly enough to construct a new one. But to a scholar who went through the Cultural Revolution and its vast destruction of China's cultural past, a scholar who was denied, for example, a proper education in the classics, things can be and feel very different, and that must be respected too. So what keeps us together between places in Beijing and Shanghai and Wuhan and several others is simply this. Every day we see new things nobody has seen for 2 millennia, and scholars around the world are now in this together. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. It raises all kinds of questions about intellectual inquiry generally, I think.
Yeah.
But we do have time for some questions. Here's Nora with the microphone.
Linda.
Yeah.
Linda.
Oh, okay. Michael.
Michael Silverstein from Chicago. This is absolutely fascinating, both because of the peculiar materiality of these narrow little bamboo strips that form the fundamental, you might call them cells, of a manuscript tradition. But what I wanted to ask about were two things, since you very intriguingly talked about finding material at the edges of the Han expansion. Yes. One, is there any evidence that other languages were written with Chinese characters? I think of the later case of Japan, where Kondoku writing was written in Chinese characters, but read off as Japanese. And also, is there any evidence for borrowing literatures which by this time were really moving across Asia?
Yeah, no. Interestingly, we have evidence for neither one. Well, where are we here historically speaking? We are right at the cusp of migrations of philosophies, of religions, of ideas. One way to define early China is to say pre-Buddhist China. So once Buddhism comes in, and that's in the 1st century of the Common Era, so my texts here are overwhelmingly before that. Once Buddhism comes in, you get all of that. And of course, you get so many contexts with surrounding cultures, that if you go then like 500, 600 years up, you see a multiplicity of languages in manuscripts that are stored or that are collected, for example, in Dunhuang, which is one of the most important relay stations of the so-called Silk Road, and where you find easily a dozen different languages. But what you don't, well, you don't have what you alluded to, the Japanese practice of using, or the Korean or the Vietnamese using Chinese characters to write their own language. What you do, of course, find is that when you translate Buddhist texts, you have two ways of translation. One is by meaning, and the other is phonetic. And then you actually are writing a foreign language with Chinese characters in phonetic use of these characters.
Are we in the balcony? Yes, Conrad.
Conrad Harper in New York City. So far, have you had any sense of change in classic Chinese texts as a result of the investigations you've conducted?
Yes. You mean change in content? Yes. I give you one example, and that's a really striking example. One of the core texts of the early Chinese intellectual and political tradition concerns the first big succession crisis that happened in 1044, 1043 BCE. The Zhou dynasty had been established for 2 years. The king, the founding king, is about to die, and his brother steps up because it was a lineage model. So the next king should be the son. The son is a very young boy, maybe 2 or 3 years of age. Then the brother of the king steps up and says, "I can do this." And then, of course, when we read the traditional account, goes to great lengths to say he offered himself. First, the brother offered himself to the spirits in a kind of oath. Offered himself, please take my life, don't take the king's life. And so the text over and over again emphasizes that he did not want to be king. He just stepped in because there was no other way to save the dynasty. Okay, now we have a manuscript from probably 300 BCE where you have exactly the same story, except one element is missing. Guess which one? He's not offering himself up at all. He says, I can do this actually better than the king, and I want to be the king. Right? So what this shows you is, of course, how the long tradition, and I mentioned, 25 centuries of continuous scholarly tradition, how this long tradition also sanitizes texts at particular moments, and we can point to particular historical times when text gets sanitized in specific ways. For example, once you get into the early empire, you really need the lineage model for the dynasty, and you have no space for example, a meritocratic appointment of a new king who is not a member of the family. And so earlier texts get sanitized and get slightly massaged into present needs, and then we see a manuscript that predates that massaging, and that is, of course, very, very exciting. Yes.
Should
Jane Sharp from UCLA. I'm Chinese born and Chinese raised. That's my mother language. Looking at your script,
Yes.
I cannot read most of them.
Right.
Now, at what stage the modern Chinese do not read that? And what is that calligraphy? What do you call that one?
Well, no contemporary person, Chinese or not, can actually read these characters like this. What you saw in these manuscripts predates the standardization of the writing system that happened, that was started with the first emperor, the famous man with his terracotta army. He started it in 221 BCE, but then it took another easily 2 centuries before the script was standardized into something that looks very similar to our characters today. And in fact, some of these texts that are happening at a later stage in this standardization, we can read. You can look at them, you can read a lot. But some of the others, you stare at them and you have no idea what it is that you're seeing. And even if you can read the characters, that doesn't mean you know what the words are that are written by these characters, because we have so many homophonous words in early China that you could borrow one character to write a word that is normally written with another character. So you can stare at this all day long and it doesn't help you. Specifically, some of these bamboo manuscripts are from the south. That's the ancient state of Chu. And Chu had its own calligraphic tradition, and so did the other states in the north, in the east, in the west, and so on. And they used different conventions in choosing particular characters for particular words. So, long story short, you're not the only one who would struggle with that.
The golden age of the Chinese literature comes
Yes.
in Tang Dynasty. At Tang Dynasty are using this kind, changing
No.
the modern script already?
No, yeah. You can read any Tang text easily. Tang would be, 600 to 900 Common Era, much later. You can easily read that.
Steve Berry, University of Chicago. Have they found any graphical materials, drawings or paintings?
Oh, yeah.
This period, because you showed us only writings, basically. And are there significant?
Let's do this as fast as I can here without breaking my thumb or the thumb
I was
drive.
thinking of landscape.
There you go. No, yeah, there you go, right? You can see that.
Oh,
You
yes.
See that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and there's plenty of that.
There are.
Or here, a garrison map
Oh, yes.
buried in a tomb, a divination diagram, yeah, and so on. Cool. Yes. Yes, they do. Plenty.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to stop and move on to our last speaker, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.